Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content.
Hey, badasses, this is Pat here. Ben is currently stuck in Brazil with his family, so we weren't able to record our normal length episode this past week. Instead, here's a short bonus episode about finding love and jobs long before the internet existed or was even a thought in anyone's mind. So sit back and enjoy these two short but funny stories.
Hello and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson. I'm here with Dr. Pat Larish, and we are going to do another one of our little short bonus episodes of some, little shorter shows where we just talk about something that isn't quite related to Badass or that doesn't quite fit in with the Badass of the Week, the main episodes that we do, or something that just we don't have enough to talk about, and it's a little bit shorter.
Yeah. So hi, badasses. So Ben, what's the badass adjacent topic you want to talk about today?
Well, I talked about the Isabella of Castile story and how I had heard the story of how the queen became the most powerful piece in chess. And I had a similar story. It's another one where I heard the story one way, and when I started digging into it, it's a little different, but it's still kind of interesting and historically significant and a fun thing to think about. So what I'm going to talk about here is I'll tell the story the way I heard it first, and then I'll get into what the reality is once I started digging into the research of it.
I feel like that's a metaphor for life.
Right, exactly. It's what we have talked about in the past too, of sometimes the good story is the one that wins out, even if it's not historically accurate.
Yeah, there's an Italian proverb I've encountered. Se non è vero, è molto ben trovato. Even if it's not true, it's a good story.
Yes. So here's what I'm going to talk about.
Tell us the story.
The story I heard was involving King Philip the Fair of France. He's the guy who is famous for wiping out the Knights Templar. They call him the Iron King. He was, kind of a pretty hardcore French king. But he's called Philip the Fair, not because he is just or fair to other people, but it's because he's pretty. It means he's good looking, right?
So fair in the slightly old-fashioned sense of good looking.
In the French, it's la belle, which is the beautiful. And so that's this Philip, and he's this very charming guy. He's a prince. He's going to become the king of France. He's he wants to get married to some good European princess to build some sort of alliance or friendship or whatever. But he's very attractive, and he's expecting that from his future bride. So the story, as I heard it, is that Philip the Fair hired a very successful portrait maker in France to travel around to the various palaces of Europe and paint portraits of the princesses. And then he came back to Paris with this stack of oil paintings that he had made of all of the princesses in Europe. And Philip the Fair, I mean, not only is he an attractive guy, but he's going to be the king of France, which is a world power, like the dominant force in Europe at the time. Very, very advantageous marriage for any princess in the realm. So
he's a very eligible bachelor.
Yes, exactly. And so he gets this stack of portraits, this stack of, small oil paintings.
I'm just picturing like a wagon stacked up with canvases. I don't know if that's how it actually happened. I would hope they protected them from the elements.
Yeah.
This is
comes back with this stack of portraits, hands them to him, and it's medieval Tinder. He's just like, put this one on there, this one goes in the pile on the right, this one goes in the pile on the left, yes, no, yes, yes, no, yes. And then he finally picks the one that he wants to marry, and he marries her. And everybody lives happily ever after, except for the Knights Templar. But apparently that's not the case. I was getting in because I wanted to tell that story this week, and I started looking into it, and that's not exactly how this happened. Although what I did come across is that this was not a completely out there idea, that this sort of thing did happen, that famous painters, because we don't have photographs in the 1400s, 1500s, you had to...
Or the internet.
Right, or the internet or any of that. So... yeah, there is a medieval Tinder, and it is literally portrait painters going around and painting pictures, and that's how you can kind of decide or at least know what this person looks like. So I've encountered variations on this story with Philip Augustus of France, the Crusader who went on the Third Crusade with Richard the Lionheart. I encountered it with Henry VIII. I encountered it with...
that guy.
Yeah. I don't want to tell that story, but it's the same thing. He was having princesses painted because he was doing the Henry VIII thing. Although that makes the story take more of like a gross turn than... because they all end up dead, right?
Okay.
So.
But the thing is, okay, like any sort of app or practice, it exists and different people are going to use it in different ways.
Yeah. He's the poster child for the like medieval, like, are we dating the same person Facebook page?
Oh, yeah.
So
hashtag it's complicated. Yeah.
Yeah. So we, the one story that I want to tell of it that I was able to verify was also a French guy, not Philip the Fair, not Philip Augustus, but Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. He hired a Dutch painter named Jan van Eyck, who's a very famous Dutch painter. He's from the Netherlands. He is occasionally credited with inventing the oil painting, which seems like a pretty impressive invention for a painter. Van Eyck he worked in The Hague in 1422, where he was employed by a guy named John the Pitiless of Holland.
Oh, that's a great name.
Right. And so this is how I get into these Wikipedia holes or these like research holes of like, well, click on that.
Yeah. Why was John pitiless exactly? You don't have to answer that because I don't want to send you down in
I know.
rabbit hole.
I spent a lot of time on this recently. Oh. John was pitiless because he was the third son. John Pitiless is interesting. He was the third son of a duke who he didn't inherit. He wasn't going to inherit because he was the third son, right? The first son inherits, and if that guy doesn't make it, the second son inherits. He's the third son. So what do you do?
There's a long wait list.
Right, he's on the wait list. So what do? You get involved in the clergy. You become a higher up in the Catholic Church because that's another way to have power, and you have ties to the king and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So Jan van Eyck works for John the Pitiless, doing portrait painting. John the Pitiless dies, so Van Eyck needs a new boss, and he goes to work for Philip the Good, who is not the son of John the Pitiless, but the son of John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, which is part of France, but it's not part of the Kingdom of France at the time. It's currently in the country of France, but at the time it was not. It was not part of the Kingdom of France. Philip the Good is famous in history because he's the guy that captured Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War. That's how we know Philip the Good. But Jan van Eyck was his personal portrait painter. And so from 1426 to 1429, Van Eyck travels around the world, and we don't know where he went. Like, there's nobody.
Like, I'm assuming not literally around the world, like not in a circle around the globe,
but it is believed that he got to the Holy Land during this time because he does later on. He does some paintings of the Holy Land, and the topography is correct. So it implies that he's traveling all over the place, and he's doing sketches and he's doing some paintings and stuff. When he comes back is when he starts creating all of these paintings, I think, based off of what he was working on his trip. He was doing some kind of secret mission for 3 years, three to 4 years, for Philip the Good. And when he came back, he had a big stack of paintings and portraits. Very few of them survive. But that's what he was doing. He was out there doing a bunch of paintings for Philip the Good. And when he came back, Philip the Good decided he was going to marry Princess Isabella of Portugal. We know that he painted her, but we don't really know the details of the rest of the trip. The story generally is accepted that like Van Eyck didn't just paint princesses all over Europe, but that like he was sent to Portugal to paint her because they were going to have an alliance marriage. One of like, the Burgundy needs to ally with Portugal, so we need you to marry the Princess of Portugal.
Yeah, so this is more just enabling an arranged courtship.
Right. And Philip the Good was like, okay, I'll marry her. I agree. But like, will you go paint her for me so that I know what I'm getting into? And he goes and he paints her.
He can manage his expectations.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And Van Eyck, apparently the portrait doesn't survive, but apparently he didn't paint her in the way she would have wanted to be painted. Apparently it wasn't super flattering painting, but it was accurate. So he was a Dutch master, and he painted a very accurate painting. And what are you going to do?
Yeah. The equivalent of not having the filters on Zoom. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And Philip the Good goes on to be kind of like a party guy. Philip the Good, like, aside from capturing Joan of Arc, he's famous for just being like a party animal. He has 3 marriages, 24 known mistresses, 18 illegitimate children. And his one legitimate son is Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, who, helps unite Burgundy he goes to war with France and the Holy Roman Empire and unites Burgundy into like a more coherent. Anyway, that's the story of that.
Okay. So not quite medieval Tinder, but a good story in its own right.
Right. And, I like to think that, Philip the Good, with all of his mistresses and marriages and partying, like, I'm sure he probably had Van Eyck paint. I feel like that wagon of portraits is not completely off the table when we talk about Jan van Eyck and Philip the Good of Burgundy. That was the closest I could get to confirming the story I had heard. There are various stories of people wanting portraits taken of people they haven't met before that they wanted to marry. And Henry VIII did have three or four different women painted so that he could decide which one he wanted to try to marry next. Okay, we're going to take a really quick break. And when we come back, I'm going to talk about not Tinder, but LinkedIn. We're going to talk about a weird historical LinkedIn story.
Okay.
All right, welcome back. We just talked about the difficulties of meeting somebody, meeting that special someone before we had dating apps, which just only makes it harder in a different way. But we're going to talk now about what employment practices were like before LinkedIn, how to market yourself before the existence of LinkedIn. Lieutenant General Friedrich Wilhelm Rudolf Gerhard August, the Freiherr Baron von Steuben, palace manager of Swabia, and major general in the colonial army. He was a general, a lieutenant general under Frederick the Great. He fought in the 7 Years' War. He was a lifetime German military officer. And in the winter of 1778, he comes to the colonies. George Washington has the kind of the battered remnants of his army at Valley Forge. They're freezing. They're under-equipped. They're losing the American War of Revolution.
Morale's probably really low.
Morale is low. Everybody's hungry. People are starving or deserting.
Life sucks.
It's the Thomas Paine when he writes, "This is the winter of our discontent." That's what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then this guy arrives, this German baron, military genius, warrior under Frederick the Great. He rolls into Valley Forge in a black carriage pulled by 4 black horses. And he's got adjutants in Prussian army uniforms with him. And he's got a bunch of guns on him. And he's this big guy with a cane and like a swagger stick. He rolls in there like a drill instructor. He whips the American army into shape, drills them, makes them a cohesive fighting force. And then when that winter ends and the next season begins, the colonial army marches out. They engage the British at Monmouth and they defeat them by with skill and ability that they have never displayed before. They catch the British by surprise. They're not expecting it. They're defeated, and it's the beginning of the end for the British Army. And the American Revolution happens, and America becomes a country. And Baron von Steuben has paintings and portraits and statues of him. The big party in Ferris Bueller's Day Off when they're singing Dankeschön, that's like Baron von Steuben Day.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Great American hero. Except, here's the thing, is that the Baron von Steuben wasn't really a general, and he wasn't really a baron, and he kind of fabricated quite a bit of his story. Kind of lied about his resume in order to get that job.
Yeah. He got results, though.
He got results, and that's the great end bit of it, right? Let's see. Friedrich von Steuben, he he's from a German family. He's from Prussia, and his father was an engineer in Frederick the Great's army. And the future Baron von Steuben, he does understand how war works. He serves as a rifleman in the 7 Years' War. He's fighting against Austria with the armies of Prussia. He fights in the Battle of Prague. He's wounded in combat against the Austrians. He's shot. He's stabbed. He's wounded again against the Russians, trying to charge cannons. He's a legitimate warrior. He's a legitimate war veteran.
Yeah, he has experience.
Yes. Yeah. He fought. He sword fought French cuirassiers. He spent a year in a Russian prisoner of war camp. He's got a good resume, but he wasn't a general. He was a captain, which is much lower in the totem pole. He survived the 7 Years' War, and he went to the German province of Hohenzollern and was kind of a staff officer there. He was a quartermaster. He was making sure everybody had guns and parts and making sure the cannons were cleaned and that kind of thing, like a paper pusher desk job kind of thing.
Yeah, very important, but not like general level stuff. Yeah,
and he wanted to he wanted to move up. He wanted to kind of get a promotion in the army, but the German state that he was working for wasn't at war. And they weren't fighting anybody. And he was running up against problems with his superiors who didn't like him. And so they weren't promoting him. And he was kind of stuck there. He was kind of stagnant. Nothing was going on. He feels like he's languishing in this job. So then he hears about the American Revolution. So he goes to Paris and he quits his job. He goes to Paris and he meets with the American ambassadors there, who are Ben Franklin and Silas Deane. He tells them that he wants to join up and like help. And whether it's him or Franklin and Deane, at some point, the letter makes its way to George Washington that the Baron Freiherr von Steuben, Lieutenant General, aide-de-camp, he passed over he was supposed to be promoted to the general staff of the Army of the Holy Roman Empire, but he's declined because he would rather serve in the U.S. Army. And so at some point, the letter that makes it to George Washington and the Continental Congress really kind of is an exaggerated resume of the actual German Baron von Steuben.
It's aspirational.
Yes. And so, of course, he gets accepted based on his cool resume. So he sails over. And do you remember I talk about him arriving in this massive black carriage pulled by 4 horses with adjutants and the uniforms and all this stuff? There's an American soldier who was at Valley Forge, and he writes about it, writes about meeting him for the first time. And he says, he seemed to me a perfect personification of Mars. The trappings of his horse, the enormous holsters of his pistols, his large size, and his strikingly martial aspect all seemed to favor the idea. And so he arrives like this. And
so he's giving God of War vibes.
God of War vibes, yes. Well, he didn't import those horses and that carriage from Prussia. He didn't even import those guys from Prussia. He goes over, he sails over, he lands in New Jersey. He buys that stuff with whatever money he has left over. He's not a rich guy. He's not actually a baron. Or if he is, I think there's some debate as to whether he had been kind of bestowed that title as like a battlefield thing or like as a but he's not like, he didn't inherit like a barony, right? He doesn't have a castle and a bunch of land. And
he doesn't have the generational wealth to back this up.
Right. So he lands there. Yeah. He buys the horse and the carriage. He puts the Prussian army uniforms on 2 guys from New Jersey that he hired.
Okay.
Then he rides out there. It's dress for the job you want, not the job you have. So he goes out there.
Badass advice.
Yes. And so he rides out there looking like this with all of these guys with him. And it turns out he can actually do it. I mean, that's the cool thing. That's the really fun bit of von Steuben.
He had confidence in himself. He knew what he could do.
Yeah.
He was just looking for the opportunity to do it.
Right. Yeah. He'd been trying to get this position for a while. Like he's led troops in battle. He knows how to load a musket and how to order guys how to do that. He was a captain of the infantry. He had a lot more combat experience than most of the colonial army. So he gets out there and he starts screaming and yelling. He doesn't speak a lot of English. The only English word he knew was goddamn. I think is what they said.
Which actually might be useful in the circumstances.
Right. So he's this drill sergeant, and he starts whipping the Americans into shape. Here's how you load the gun. Here's how you march. And do it faster. Can you do it faster, faster, faster? When they mess up, he starts cursing at them in German and in French, because he speaks both of those. So he starts cursing at him in German and French. And then remember those two adjutants that were with him? And then he'll just when he's getting really frustrated, he'll hit one of those guys. He'll elbow that guy. And then that guy will start screaming at him in English.
Oh, hey.
These are my anger interpreters.
Ooh,
I'm mad. I'm screaming. You only hit this guy. You go. That's your turn. Scream at them.
Yeah. Okay, so he can yell at them. He and his team can yell at them in at least 3 different languages.
Right. Yeah. And so, and it works. And he does whip the colonial army into shape, and he does do the thing that he promised he was going to do. But even though he might not have actually represented himself in the way that he might have, or somebody during translation might have exaggerated his credentials a little bit. But hey, it works out.
It does. Yeah.
He gets hired. He survives the war. He retires on this 16,000 acre farm in upstate New York. And
hey, that sounds nice.
And now September 17th every year is Baron von Steuben Day in the U.S.
Mark your calendars.
All right. I thought that was interesting. This was another one of, like I said, one of our little bonus episodes. I'm going to talk about Tinder and LinkedIn from before the internet times. Life was hard.
Life was hard. Well, life was hard in some ways, but it seems like there were opportunities in other ways.
Yeah, that's fair. All right. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for listening. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
Stay badass. And don't lie on your resume. Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are Andrew Jacobs, me, Pat Larish, and my co-host, Ben Thompson. Writing is by me and Ben. Story editing is by Ian Jacobs, Brandon Phibbs. Mixing and music and sound design is by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeart. Badass of the Week is based on the website badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions, ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like the podcast, subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and your enemies if you want, as we'll be back next week with another one. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.